Hello, everyone. Whoa, like the effect, like a rock stadium effect. Great to see you here. I'm going to move this farther away from my mouth. So I'm here to introduce Steve. Steve's going to talk for a while, and then Dennis and Sheila and I are all going to kind of have a conversation with Steve and with you all too. There are a lot of smart people in the audience, not the least of which is my board member Mike Peabody right there, who just turned 90 years old. So a lot of you guys know Steve. If you didn't know him before this book came out, you probably Googled him. But let me just break down. There's no way I can possibly capture the man in 2 minutes. So I figured I'd just do two categories of his life. One is the founder category, and one is the author category. So Steve is the founder of American Lawyer Magazine, which was the first media outlet to really cover the legal industry as an industry. Court TV, which was the first to actually put cameras in courtrooms throughout the country and make judges cool. Brill's Content, which was one of the first great attempts to do kind of a watchdogging of the journalism community itself. Journalism Online, which was a very successful attempt to get major media corporations to create a common paywall so they could begin monetizing the great work that they do with their audiences. Clear, which you guys now see in airports. That was Steve's initial idea to help ease traffic through America's airports. And then NewsGuard, which is his most recent effort, which I've done some collaborating with him on to fight fake news and help reconsolidate readers and ad dollars around places that provide good, honest information to the public. So that's the founder, just the founder category. Author of Class Warfare, author of After, How America Confronted the September 12th Era, author of America's Bitter Pill, which was a New York Times bestseller, and then, of course, of Tailspin, most recently, which is also on the bestsellers list, and about which Bob Woodward wrote, a penetrating and personal examination of why the United States is in the midst of a nervous breakdown. But with his fantastically reported story, Brill also shows how and who might restore some common sense and equilibrium. So that, as I said, I'm not going to mention the other stuff like columnist and contributing editor at Newsweek, journalism professor at Yale, et cetera, et cetera. Steve, I've known him for about a year now, is a man with a wry sense of humor, a strong sense of truth and justice, and a very sharp pen to back it all up. So, Steve Brill.
Thank you, Nick, for that introduction. Is this working on? We're good? And thank you all for being here. What I thought I would do is talk for a little while and then, more importantly, have the conversation that I'm anxious to have with the three folks who are sitting here. This book really tries to answer a question that most of us, regardless of our political leanings, have been asking ourselves some version of over the last 2 or 3 years. And that question is basically, how did we get here? How did the world's greatest democracy and economy become a land of crumbling roads, galloping income inequality, bitter polarization, and dysfunctional government? And that question comes in lots of versions, but here's the version that I asked myself about 2.5 years ago. My wife and I had just arrived from Europe and gotten into Kennedy Airport. We had trudged through one of the crowded, filthy, grimy terminals that is Kennedy Airport, and we gotten into a cab, and we were stuck on the expressway that goes from Kennedy into Manhattan, the Van Wyck, for those of you who are familiar with New York. It was ugly, clogged, lots of potholes, and in the middle of the Van Wyck is something that just drives me crazy. There's a tram, and the tram goes all the way from JFK Airport, 8 miles into Jamaica, Queens. It doesn't go into the center city, which is, and I always think about that tram whenever I'm on the Van Wyck, because it's just so absolutely absurd. Billions had been spent to take people from the airport, again, not into the center of the city, the way mass transit does at any other capital in the world, including actually this one, but 8 miles into Jamaica. Now, whose idea was that of efficient mass transit? And as I thought about that, I turned to my wife and asked what she thought a visitor who had never been to America would think of America's gateway city if he or she had arrived where we had just arrived and was now stuck where we were stuck. Then I rattled off a litany of other examples of the wrong kind of American exceptionalism. The fact that we pay more for healthcare than any other country in the world, and our results are no better and often worse. The fact that we pay more for public education than any other country in the world, and our results are markedly in the middle, if not worse. Or the failure that we've had to enact a comprehensive budget in this country since 1994. And I went on and I started, just rattling on about, why are we the only country that allows prescription drug makers to advertise on television, and the cost of our prescription drugs is sky high. All this stuff that was really bothering me. And then I mentioned the capper at the time, which seemed to be, yet another glaring but seemingly temporary sign of the wrong kind of American exceptionalism. The fact that this guy, Donald Trump, seemed to be leading, maybe temporarily, in the primary polls and in the Republican primary. So how did this happen to us, I asked my wife, whereupon she mumbled something about, well, maybe that's a book. As I tried to find the answer over the last 2 years, what I discovered was a recurring irony. The core values that make America great began about 5 decades ago to bring America down. They became the often unintended instruments for splitting the country into 2 classes, the protected and the unprotected. The First Amendment, for example, became a tool for the wealthy to put a thumb on the scales of our democracy. Due process became an instrument to block all types of government activity meant to protect the unprotected, from enforcing job safety rules to maintaining adequate mass transit and passable roads to holding corporate criminals to account. Reforms meant to enhance our democracy undercut our democracy by making low turnout, polarizing primaries the vehicles of choice. Classic American ingenuity brought not only life-changing technology breakthroughs, but also trailblazing financial and legal engineering that turned our economy from an engine of long-term growth and shared prosperity into a casino with a few big winners. And as I'll explain, the most ironic of those boomerangs involved what is perhaps the most apple pie American value of all, meritocracy. But first, let's step back and ask, who are the protected that I just mentioned? Well, who are the unprotected, rather? These are the 99% of our country who may be self-reliant and willing to work hard, but who rely on their government to work for the common good, to ensure a decent minimum wage, for example, or a fair tax system, and a democracy that gives them an equal voice. They rely on their country to provide a safe, fair workplace and job training that's necessary to participate in a dynamic marketplace and economy that rightly welcomes technology and globalization. These, along with access to healthcare and to public education, are the common goods that any government is supposed to provide. But the protected can buy their own uncommon goods. They can buy private schools, squadrons of lawyers and lobbyists, the best accountants for tax planning. They don't need government, and often government is a threat because it taxes them, enforces labor or antitrust laws against them, or otherwise tries to erect the appropriate guardrails against conduct that hurts everyone else. This book explains how that division, that large-scale abandonment of the common good, happened. If you're a Democrat, it explains how we went from JFK to Trump. If you're a Republican, it explains how we went from Eisenhower to, well, Trump. In either case, it uncovers the people and the forces that hijack those core values in a way that negatively affects the lives of everyday Americans. Now, I'm not going to try to recap the whole book, but I will here attempt to tease you with how two of those core values were turned against the common good, which suggests, I think, a lot of the ironies and surprises that abound in the whole book. First, a scene in the book. One day last year, I spent the afternoon in a windowless room in a nondescript small office building about a block from the Capitol. There, a member of Congress, a smart, decent, serious-minded person who went into public service for all the right reasons, was sitting at a desk making phone calls as fast as he could. On his desk was a lamp, and on the lamp was a Post-it note in his handwriting saying, quote, "I don't give a shit," unquote. The congressman was dialing for donors, begging for money. Why the Post-it note, I asked him. Because, he explained, when I'm in this room, I have to stay focused and go fast. I can't give a shit. As in, oh, how are you? Oh, your wife died? Oh, that's awful. She was a wonderful person, really wonderful person, and I'm really sorry. But, next month is the end of the quarter, and we really want to be able to file and show that we've raised lots of money. So I'd really, really appreciate it if you could write a check to MaxNet this afternoon. He dials for dollars 4 to 5 hours a day, every weekday, and every night near the end of the quarter, he goes to fundraiser cocktail parties, taking checks from lobbyists who have organized the events and brought clients who want access to him. When I spent one night doing that with him, I couldn't help but thinking that this could not be what the founding fathers had in mind for Congress. So whose fault is this? Well, it's the work of a young man, now a prominent law professor, who wanted to make his mark as a Harvard law student in the early 1970s. His idea was to write a provocative paper arguing for the first time that corporations had the same First Amendment rights as people. It's also the fault, accidentally, of lawyers working for Ralph Nader, one of whom is with us tonight, who seized on his idea to convince the Supreme Court in 1976 that corporations, in this case discount pharmacies wanting to advertise their low prices, that these pharmacies, which were corporations, had corporate First Amendment rights. How the First Amendment morphed into a weapon that corrupted the political system so completely, and that now threatens to derail even government regulations of corporate speech meant to protect consumers, including protect them with the proper labeling of drugs, irony of ironies. How that all happened is the story of how special interests, the protected, were able to polarize and paralyze the country in order to dominate our government. Now, that dominance has been propelled by the shock troops of the new knowledge economy, lawyers and lobbyists, which brings me to a second example of a core value that produced unintended consequences, meritocracy. In 1964, I was growing up in a working class section of Queens, One day, I read in a biography of John Kennedy that he had gone to something called a prep school named Choate. None of my teachers at Junior High School 198 had a clue what that meant, but I soon figured out that prep school was like college. You got to go to classes and live on a campus, only you got to go 4 years earlier, which seemed to me like a great idea. The idea seemed even better because I discovered that some prep schools had started offering financial aid. I ended up at Deerfield Academy in Western Massachusetts, where the headmaster told my worried parents, who ran a perpetually struggling little liquor store, that his financial aid policy was that they should send him a check every year for whatever they felt they could afford. 4 years later, in 1967, I found myself in the headmaster's office one afternoon, and it was the fall of my senior year. He had given his office over to a man named R. Inslee Clark, the dean of admissions at Yale. Clark looked over my record and asked me a bunch of questions, most of which, for some reason, were about where I had grown up and how I had ended up at Deerfield. He seemed intrigued by the JFK and Choate story. Then he paused, looked me in the eye, and asked if I really, really wanted to go to Yale, if Yale was my first choice. When I said yes, his reply was instant. Then I can promise you that you're in. I'll tell the headmaster that you don't have to apply anywhere else. Just kind of keep it to yourself. What I didn't know then was that I was part of a revolution being led by Inky Clark. That was his nickname, Inky. I was about to become one of what would later come to be known as Inky's boys and later girls. We were part of a meritocracy revolution that flourished at Yale and other elite institutions, at law firms and investment banks in the mid-1960s and 1970s. It was a great thing for me and for so many other people, including my wife, who became one of Inky's girls. But it turns out that even this great thing had a downside. At a Yale Law School graduation in 2015, a professor who had been chosen by the graduating class to be their speaker described the meritocracy revolution that Clark had ignited 48 years before. But then he bummed out his audience with this message. Because elites could now spend what they needed to spend in order to send their children to the best schools, to buy them the tutoring they needed for standardized testing like the college boards, and otherwise ensure that their kids could outcompete their peers to secure the same spots at the top that their parents had achieved. Economic diversity at the elite schools was, if anything, now worse than it was 3 or 4 decades ago. He used lots of numbers to back that up, as I do in my book. He told the students, although it was once the engine of American social mobility, a meritocracy today has become precisely what it was invented to combat, a mechanism for the dynastic transmission of wealth and privilege across the generations. Meritocracy, he concluded, now constitutes a modern-day aristocracy, built for a world in which the greatest source of wealth is not land or factories, but human capital, the labor of skilled workers. These skilled workers, those who won the meritocracy race, became the knowledge worker generation. They were legal engineers inventing tender offers and takeovers. They were lawyers insisting on an absolutely absurd and expanded version of another great American value, due process, in order to block regulations or turn them into decades-long drafting battles, ending in thousands of pages of detail whose meaning could be debated through more due process whenever they were enforced. They blocked labor law enforcement and created arbitration clauses to keep everyday Americans out of court when they had consumer or employment discrimination claims. And in the book, I should add that I fess up to having had a role in boosting this lawyer meritocracy by taking a lead in celebrating the success and the riches of these legal engineers. In 1979, I started a magazine called The American Lawyer, which focused on the business of law firms, as Nick mentioned. I thought of these firms as big, powerful businesses with intriguing questions lurking behind their uniformly elegant reception areas. Which ones were best managed? Which offered the most opportunity to minorities or to women? Which were more likely to promote their associates into partnership because they were economically healthy? Which had the fairest or most generous system of awarding bonuses to their young associates? And yes, which had the most interesting clients and a client base that provided the highest profit per partner? That last question resulted in The American Lawyer launching a special issue every summer, beginning in 1985, in which we deployed our reporters to pierce the secrecy of these private partnerships so that the magazine could rank the average profit taken home by partners at the largest firms. When the first survey was published, I received a call from a former Yale Law School classmate of mine who practiced at a large Los Angeles firm. He was outraged because he and his wife had now found out that another classmate who worked literally down the block at another seemingly fungible large Los Angeles firm was making 25% more than he was. Until then, he had been perfectly happy with his six-figure income. Not anymore. Sure, this new flow of market information about these businesses made those who ran them more accountable to their partners, their employees, and their clients. It also made them much more eager to find places for people who had the most talent, regardless of their race, religion, or gender. That's the good part. But it also transformed the practice of law by the country's most talented lawyers in ways that had significant drawbacks. The emphasis was now fully on serving those clients who could pay the most, with pro bono work, professionalism, collegiality, often taking a back seat. And with the emphasis on talent, on recruiting those who had won the meritocracy race, rather than members of the old boys network, the big firms were now much fairer, but also much better able to serve and defend those clients. Others, including lots of lawyers, became the financial engineers of their generation at investment banks and other firms. They spun out trailblazing inventions meant to boost short-term gains in stocks, like stock buybacks, derivatives, credit default swaps, you name it, while hollowing out the long-term economy on which the middle class depends. Breakthroughs in technology enabled automation and globalization, which added to the disruption of the economic security of the middle class. So again, the pattern is we make progress, but we don't take care of the downside of that progress. In 1971, a young Nixon aide named Peter Peterson, VP Peterson, the founder of Blackstone, then a young Nixon aide, warned the Nixon cabinet and the president in a long memo that drastic improvements in job training and retraining programs were needed to enable that middle class to survive in the coming new automated and globalized economy. He was ignored. The 50-year failure, which I spend a fair amount of time in the book attempting to document, the 50-year failure of the Trade Adjustment Assistance job retraining program pushed by President Kennedy in 1962 was also ignored by Nixon and every president after him. If you search the archives, as I did, for the 55 years that followed when Kennedy introduced that program in 1962, you see a total of 2 substantive news articles in any newspaper, magazine, or broadcast network across the country since 1962 describing that crucial program and how it worked or, in fact, did not work. We ignored these people. So, should the frustration in much of the country over how the winners in the meritocracy have played such a massive role in keeping government from delivering common goods really be a surprise? The frustrated, disillusioned Americans, I finally decided to the end of the book, who voted for President Trump actually committed the ultimate act of rejecting the meritocrats, who were epitomized by the hardworking, always prepared, Wellesley and Yale law educated, but seemingly cold and calculating Hillary Clinton, in favor of the opposite, an inexperienced, never prepared, 6 times bankrupted, vulgar, shoot from the hip heir to a real estate fortune. Now, as I said, there are lots of other people and lots of other forces that are part of this same unhappy, slow motion 50-year story, including, again, breakthroughs in media technology, for example, which democratized media, but also undermined much of journalism and exacerbated the polarization that we all now feel. So that's the story of the Tailspin, except it's not the whole story. Oddly enough, this is a shockingly hopeful book. And the reason it's a hopeful book, in part, is because of the people you see sitting here, and some of their colleagues in some of the other spheres that I write about. In every area that I write about, in every area that America has fallen, I found people who were working effectively to reverse the fall. I saw a young Iraqi war vet and Harvard grad who had created a program at a converted zipper factory in Queens that trains waitresses, bar bouncers, and sales clerks to become software coders. They join the program, which is free, with average income of $18,000, and are placed 11 months later into jobs averaging $85,000. And this guy has even figured out a way to make the program self-sustaining and scalable. I discovered that the Aspen Institute has a project in New York that has recruited a growing group of business leaders to fight corporate short-termism. I watched 2 groups in Washington, represented here, OpenSecrets and Issue 1, work to stir up public disgust with how money has come to dominate politics and channel that disgust into growing movements for real reform. I saw how leaders of Baruch College in Manhattan and Amherst College have put Yale and Harvard to shame when it comes to achieving real economic diversity. Others, such as the Bipartisan Policy Center and the Partnership for Public Service, as well as the Better Markets, have created blueprints for financial reform and for government reform, and have created movements that, when people start to listen to them more than they now are, will pave the way for real change. And I discovered that Peter Edelman, America's leading anti-poverty policy thinker, has put together a detailed blueprint for uniting the cause of the poor and that of the working class by creating an entirely new employment infrastructure in this country. His idea is to create millions of good-paying jobs while serving a looming demographic crisis by hiring and training well-paid elder caregivers and preschool child care educators. Now, the question that I faced as I was meeting these people, including the 3 people here, is are they whistling in the wind? And each of them will tell you that in one way or another, I asked them that question, sort of, why are you doing this? I mean, this is the Trump administration. Why are you waking up every morning and doing this stuff. And I thought they were sort of naive. And as a reporter, you tend to, your skepticism, sometimes, turns into cynicism when it shouldn't. But then I really sort of dug into their resumes and, more important, poured through their work. And they are anything but naive. They are doing what they do despite developments in America that seem to be galloping in the opposite direction, not because they are gluttons for frustration, but because they believe that America can be put back on the right course. And I think they're right. I think that when Americans realize that someone who used their frustration to scam them is not the answer, they will turn to leaders who are prepared, intelligent, sincere, and are able to unite them rather than play them. I believe that these new achievers, like those who are here tonight, who are fighting the tailspin on all fronts, are laying the groundwork for disgust to be channeled into restoration. In 2018, these people give new meaning to the word resilience, and they make me believe in our country's resilience. There is nothing wrong with the core values that brought the tailspin. They just need to be redirected back to the common good. That's the message that I hope this book conveys. Thank you. So what I'm going to do, I think, ask you guys some questions. I didn't ask you testing your line from the book. But there be a question. But also maybe repeat some of the questions. But before I do that, starting with Nick, would you three introduce yourself again? Just give a capsule what you guys do. Nick, you start.
Sure. So Nick Penniman with Issue 1. We founded Issue 1 about 5 years ago to seek a bipartisan pathway for political reform. We work mainly on the role and influence of money in politics, also do some work on gerrymandering, and increasingly ethics and this thing called the Emoluments Clause that no one had ever heard of until about a year and a half ago. So we've got 200 former members of Congress who have joined us, half Republican, half Democrat. We've got a bunch of champions on both the Senate and the House side. There's a group called the Congressional Reformers Caucus that was recently founded, 15 Republicans, 15 Democrats on the House side, all coming together to work on creating a common dialogue, energy, and policy ideas around fixing the political system.
Sheila.
Hi, Sheila Krumholz. There we go. I'm with the Center for Responsive Politics, and we are a 35-year-old organization tracking money in politics at the federal level. So we track campaign donations. That was along our bailiwick, identifying the organizations and industries associated with each and every PAC and individual donation, soft money to the parties, morphed into 527 donations, 527 organizations, and now super PACs and dark money. So we follow the evolution of the flow of money wherever it leads us. And we do that with about 20 fantastic researchers, technology folks, developers, and communicators. We've got reporters, reporting interns who do incredible work. And so with just 20 people, we churn out millions of data points. We're grooming them constantly. Not just campaign donations, lobbying, revolving door, personal finances, which is, as we know, more important than ever, both for Congress and for the executive branch. And then we present it in a way that we hope is going to break through to the public. Naturally, we're just one small organization in DC, so we work intensively with the press, advocates, academics. We have about a few dozen academics, largely, who download our archive of data to do their own scholarly work with it in ways that we could never hope to achieve. But we're presenting it all and grooming it and curating it and making it available for everyone to do what they will. As I just said, many of our most intensive users are lobbyists and corporations who love free data. But that's kind of a, something we have to put up with to make it available for free to the public.
So that data, by the way, is available on OpenSecrets.org. And one of the things, I guess I'll just ask you, why don't you just change your name to OpenSecrets.org so you wouldn't have to explain to people quite what you do.
What a novel idea. Well, okay, I do this all the time. You're probably going to say, don't do this, but Nick is my board member. How many think we should change it to OpenSecrets.org? Show of hands. I would have thought 100%, but time and time again, it's like 50%. So.
No, but the ones who say you shouldn't are just the ones who say, gee, it's such a pain in the neck to change your name. You got to do all this stuff. It's not a substance argument. It's a process argument not to change the name.
It's a consideration.
But if you go to the website, I mean, it is literally a daily diary of the corruption of American democracy. And reporters always use it. They have been successful now in getting most reporters who use it to at least cite you. But again, when they cite the Center for Responsive Politics, it doesn't. It should be Open Secrets, but that's another issue. Anyway, Dennis.
Hi, I'm Dennis Kelleher. We founded Better Markets in September of 2010 because shortly before that, in July of 2010, the Dodd-Frank Financial and Consumer Protection Act was passed. I'm sure most of you remember all too well the financial crash of 2008. Lehman Brothers crashed, and frankly, the entire financial system crashed. What most of you probably don't know, and we did a study on this that we put out, is the financial crash is going to cost the United States more than $20 trillion. That's more than $170,000 for every living man, woman, and child in this country. Nothing else compares to a cost to a country. And in fact, in history, if you go back, often what destroys countries are financial crashes, but nothing compares to the economic wreckage. And that doesn't include the human wreckage of lives destroyed, jobs gone, communities gone. And that's what happened in this country and in the globe in 2008. So the Congress and President Obama passed a financial reform law in 2008, in 2010, to address some of the structural problems that gave rise to the last crash and hopefully provided some remedies that would prevent or mitigate the next crash. At the time I was working in the Senate and had experienced the onslaught, and Steve very capably details this in his book, of something like there were 2,200 lobbyists who were lobbying on Dodd-Frank. A quarter of them were former office holders, and 50% of them were former staffers. So the revolving door, cash, et cetera, it's almost indescribable, the Wall Street lobbying effort to kill the legislation. And there was, and Steve got this too in the book, right, which is when it was passed, the lobbyist was asked something like, well, boy, you must really feel bad. You just lost. And he said, lost? This is halftime, baby. Because they know the permanent influence industry, and Steve loves to talk about lawyers and lobbyists, but he needs to broaden it to PR firms, purchased academics, front groups, trade groups. I mean, when you get done with it all, there's a huge industry that builds these moats and protects these moats, and nobody's better at it than Wall Street. So we created Better Markets to essentially be a counterweight to the biggest banks on Wall Street throughout the legal and policy and rulemaking process in the United States to get the Dodd-Frank law turned into a reality with hundreds of rules that had to be passed to implement it, with two primary goals, one of which everybody talks about, one of which nobody talks about. The goal everybody talks about is to prevent financial crashes so that the country does not have to go through the incredibly costly crash that we did in 2008, both in economic and human terms. But the other part of Dodd-Frank was to rebalance and refocus the financial system on supporting the real economy instead of the gambling that Steve was talking about. The problem is the gambling is incredibly lucrative and juices the bonuses. Real banking to the real economy has a relatively small margin. But taxpayers, everybody in this room backs the banking system in this country, because at the end of the day, if it's going to collapse, the government's going to put their hand in your pocket to bail them out, which is what happened in '08. So if we're going to bail them out, at a minimum, they should at least be engaging in activity that supports the reason for their public support. So what we've done over the last 8 years or so is we participate in 250 rulemakings, 35 litigations. We do a lot of media. We're bettermarkets.com. You can go to our website. We put out reports. But basically, if you're in Washington, D.C. in the policymaking process anywhere, if you see Goldman Sachs or J.P. Morgan or Citigroup, and you look to the exact opposite, that's where Better Markets is.
So one of the questions I mentioned in my talk, but I asked all of you, is especially now, how do you get up in the morning? I mean, Nick, let's start with you. I mean, why do you think things are going to change when they're just galloping in the opposite direction?
Well, the good news is that this is a bottoming out moment. We think of, there's some more board members. Hi, JB. You guys know the game Jenga, where you build the tower of blocks, and the last person to pull the last block out loses. So we think about what's happened to our democracy in the last 30 years as being the depletion of the Jenga tower. Money in politics has gotten much worse in the last 30 years, not just since Citizens United. Voting has gotten much worse in the last 30 years. Gerrymandering, we went from 165 competitive districts in '98 to 45 today. Information integrity, obviously, fake news, the collapse of the Fourth Estate. All of these things have occurred over time. And a lot of the people in this room have been both watching these things occur and working on them at the same time. Guys like Nick Neihart, who's been running public campaign for 25 years, and Larry Noble next to him. So it's not that there hasn't been some degree of attention paid, but all of a sudden what's happened is Trump's come along and he's wiggling at one of the final blocks. And that block is the democratic norms and standards block. And as a result of that, people all of a sudden are panicking, as Woodward said about Steve's book, are panicking. And they're wondering, why is it that American democracy seems so fragile and so vulnerable all of a sudden? Well, the fact is that it hasn't happened all of a sudden. So what this opportunity offers us is the ability to rush in with a story that is larger than Trump, to explain the structural deficiencies and breakdowns that have occurred over the last 3 decades, and then to piece together a coalition and a slate of ideas that are powerful enough to begin repairing the tower. So it is, in a way, the Trump panic and this bottoming out moment that gives me the most amount of hope. I feel like the Novocaine has worn off in the system, and the nerve endings are now signaling hard.
So you now have a different metaphor. The one you used that I quote in the book was that it's the alcoholic whose liver just can't take another drink anymore.
I must have stayed up late the night before I told you that.
They're both actually pretty good. And I will tell you that there's a quote that I didn't use because it sort of became kind of the theme of the last chapter of the book. I was interviewing Joe Stiglitz, the economist, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, and he's explaining to me, we're talking about, international trade, and he says, well, when you add, 2 billion workers to the job market, wages in the United States are going to go down. And we're having this long discussion about this, and finally I said, well, how are things, going to get better? And we go through the whole litany of stuff in the book. And he says, well, it's actually pretty simple. Things are going to get so bad that they're going to get good. And that's kind of what I say at the end of the book, that people are just going to snap, whether it's about, campaign money or, Dodd-Frank. I mean, it's great. I'm really cheered to know that we've now cut back on Dodd-Frank, because you can explain to the group how the big banks have been suffering under Dodd-Frank. Will you just give some...
When they say they're crying all the way to the bank, I mean, it's just a gross understatement. One of the, objective facts really, even before Trump, I mean, Trump has taken it to a different level, but they really don't mean anything in the Washington policymaking circles. And so when Dodd-Frank was passed, and this is exactly the same that what happened after the Great Depression, and the laws were passed after the Great Depression. All the banks and then said, it's going to be a socialist country, there'll be no banks, we'll all be living in the streets, there'll be no mortgages, no homes, because of onerous regulation, and the government will control everything. This time they just said, you'll destroy the banks, there'll be no profits and no revenues, and therefore we won't be able to lend to people, and therefore everybody won't be able to buy homes and cars, and there'll be no prosperity in America.
And our market share is going to be destroyed.
And, yeah, I mean, everything, right? It's like Obama was going to be running the financial system personally from the White House. And yet here we are, we've just hit the 5th record revenue, profits, and this year bonuses for the financial industry. Their profits in the first quarter of 2008, the first quarter, 58 billion, if I'm remembering right, 58 billion. The profits in the first quarter went up 13% over the first quarter last year before the effect of the tax bill. So the pure profits were 13%. Add the tax bill, it was 28. So it's just objectively false that the financial reform law or the regulations have in any way interfered with the bank's revenue, profitability, bonuses, and importantly, lending.
So why don't you just go home then? Why?
Well, it's somewhere in here. There's a little discussion about, and this gets back to my colleagues who I'm actually I'm huge fans of and honored to be here with. Sometimes facts don't mean as much as, I don't know, money, for example. And in fact, I wanted to, if I can, there's this great article, it's just in the paper, and you say, why are the three of us here and are we connected? So there's this article in the New York Times called The First 2020 Race is Underway, Scrambling for New York Donors. And so the information in here, the factual information, comes from this weird little group called OpenSecrets, right? And that's where everybody gets their data, the 800-pound data gorilla right here. I mean, she says, we're just this little organization. Yeah, it's a little organization. Hold on. And then what does it talk about? It talks about money and politics. Issue 1. I mean, everywhere you look. And then how does it tie together? Where are they where does the information come from where they get the money? They're all on Wall Street. I mean, and it details how all the money and all the candidates who are thinking of running for 2020, they had their reception, their meeting at the Carlyle Group or at Morgan Stanley or throughout the financial sector.
But aren't people, isn't the danger that people are just numb to the stuff that you guys work on? They just sort of accept it like the weather. I mean, when I was reporting the book and I would talk to people about, money and politics, it was like, yeah, and it could rain tomorrow too. That's just the state of affairs in this country. And I remember having this conversation. We had a brown bag lunch. I'm in your office with your staff. The most psyched up, smart, totally jazzed about everything they're doing, group of people you can imagine. And I started feeling really bad about asking this question. But of course, I asked
not so
anyway.
bad you didn't ask them.
I didn't feel that bad. So, and I basically said something to the effect, why are you doing this? Donald Trump is president. Now you're worried about, some congressman who has a conflict of interest because he took a donation for that. Look at the White House for credit. I mean, nobody cares. And you said.
And I said, unless and until Nick Neihart is successful in bringing public financing to the federal level, we need to know who's giving the money, where it's going, and why. And that needs to be available to every American, because if and when they realize, oh, crap, I own this government, it's on me, it's my responsibility to be engaged and to make change. I need to get smart. We want them to be able to come to us to get smart on the money, which is just one facet. It's just one window on Washington, but it's a critical one.
It's a big window. I have this idea that I floated in the book that I just, since you're stuck here for the next 15 or 20 minutes, I'll just float again. And that is the final use of all your information, I think, should be that whenever you see a congressional hearing on C-SPAN, you have, the nameplate of the member of Congress who's asking questions. Under the person's name, in parentheses, should be $140,000. Whatever the amount of money that congressman has taken from the industry or industries that are the subject of the hearing, that should be listed under the person's name. Now, she has that information. She absolutely, positively, you could get that information in minutes. And I wish that some, and the New York Times, if they're writing about a hearing, Senator Schumer, parentheses, $482,000, close parentheses, said that the health care bill is X. And if you just embarrass people to death if you do that. Why can't somebody do that?
You're the guy who created Court TV. You should know how to get those logos on the...
I mean, if I ran C-SPAN, I would do that, which of course is why no one would let me run C-SPAN. But I think that is, I mean, it is just so relevant. I think I told you that I testified at a hearing reluctantly after my healthcare thing came out, and it was about transparency, and I scrapped the speech that I had submitted for the record and just went through how much each member of the finance committee had gotten from the healthcare industry, which was a lot of fun. I didn't get invited back, which was actually the purpose, because journalists shouldn't be testifying in hearings anyway.
It also gets back to why we do it. I mean, I think Justice Brandeis was right a long time ago, which is sunlight is the best disinfectant, and special interest in the non-common good special interest thrives and succeeds in darkness and dark corners. Nothing calls them out, and nothing makes advances better than what OpenSecrets is doing and what Nick is doing, and calling them out and shining a light on it. We do the same thing when Wall Street. Wall Street doesn't go up to Congress and say, here's a bill, we'd like you all to co-sign it and co-sponsor it, and we'd like it to go through the regular process and have hearings where you listen to both sides and you make a good judgment on the merits. The merits and sunlight scare them. And so a big part of what we do is shining a light on it. And ultimately that light, I don't know, I can't compete with Nick's metaphors, but ultimately that light will ignite enough interest / disgust that people will be responsive. And they are responsive to it. I mean, one of